October 14th, 2018, 7:42 in the morning. A hammer struck cinder block in a basement renovation on a quiet residential street, and the sound that came back was wrong. Not the solid thud of concrete meeting metal, but something hollow, something that suggested empty space where there should have been none. The foreman tapped again, pressed his ear to the plaster, and frowned. Within hours, police would stand in that same basement, staring at a chain door that had been locked from the outside for more than 2 decades. Behind it, they would find a woman who had been 17 years old when she disappeared, and who had spent 23 years giving birth to 20 children in captivity, each one taken from her arms by the man she called father. This is the story of Amira Brooks, of the basement that became her world, and of the neighborhood that heard her cries but chose silence over scrutiny. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. July 12, 1995. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor hummed with the particular frequency that healthcare workers learn to ignore, a steady electric buzz that marks the rhythm of night shifts and long hours. Lena Brooks had worked at St. Michael's Medical Center for nearly 15 years, known among her colleagues as the nurse who stayed late when others wanted to clock out, who volunteered for the difficult cases, who remembered patients' names long after they'd been discharged. She was 38 years old, a woman whose warmth seemed to fill whatever room she entered. And on this particular night, she was charting vitals at the nurses' station when her body simply gave out. One moment she was writing, the next her colleagues were rushing to her side as she collapsed. Her heart had stopped, despite every effort from the staff who knew her, who loved her, who had shared countless shifts with her. Lena Brooks could not be saved. For her 17-year-old daughter Amira, the world fractured. Neighbors would later recall seeing the teenager standing on the porch in the days following her mother's death. Barefoot face pressed against the screen door, watching every car that passed, as if expecting Lena to return from some errand she'd forgotten to mention. The girl was caught in that terrible space between childhood and adulthood, still needing guidance, still needing the kind of unconditional love that only a mother can provide. And now she had only one parent left. Dr. Elias Brooks was 42 years old in the summer of 1995, a registered nurse with a reputation for precision and competence. He had worked alongside his wife at St. Michael's for years, and their colleagues described them as a devoted couple, quiet but steady, the kind of partnership that seemed built to last. Elias rarely joked, rarely showed much emotion at all, keeping his feelings tucked behind pressed shirts and a calm professional demeanor that some mistook for stoicism and others simply accepted as his nature. In the immediate aftermath of Lena's death, he appeared to be exactly what people expected: a grieving widower struggling to hold himself together, a father trying to be strong for his daughter while processing his own unbearable loss. People offered sympathy, casseroles, prayers. They told him to take all the time he needed. And within 3 weeks of Lena's funeral, Elias handed in his resignation at the hospital. He told his supervisor and several close colleagues that the building felt haunted, that every corner whispered his wife's name, that he couldn't continue working in the place where she had died. He said he needed to be home for Amira, that she needed stability and his full attention during this devastating time. His words drew understanding nods and compassionate looks. No one questioned his decision. No one realized that by leaving the hospital, Elias was severing the one connection to people who might have noticed what would happen next. In the months following Lena's death, relatives attempted to stay in touch with Amira. An aunt called several times, offering to have the girl spend part of the summer with her family. A cousin reached out, suggesting Amira might benefit from being around other young people who could support her. But Elias's answers were always smooth, always reasonable, always just detailed enough to sound true. He told one relative that Amira was staying with an aunt upstate for a while, that she needed a change of scenery. He told another that he'd enrolled her in a boarding school that specialized in helping teenagers process grief, that the structure and counseling would be good for her. His tone carried the kind of quiet authority that discourages follow-up questions, and because he had been a healthcare professional, because he seemed to understand trauma and recovery, people trusted his judgment. The stories shifted slightly depending on who was asking, but the core message remained consistent. Amira was fine, she was somewhere else, she was being cared for. And in an era before smartphones made constant contact expected, before social media turned every teenager's life into a public record, it was disturbingly easy for a 17-year-old girl to simply disappear from view. There was no missing person report filed, no search organized, no urgent calls to authorities. Amira wasn't considered lost, she was considered relocated, as if her entire existence had been neatly transferred to some other life that didn't require explanation. The neighborhood continued its ordinary routines. People waved to Elias when he trimmed his hedges on Saturday mornings. They passed him at New Hope Baptist Church, where he sat quietly in the second pew from the back, hat in hand, accepting condolences months after the funeral. One neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Porter, who lived across the street, later admitted that she had once thought she heard a young girl's voice near the basement window of the Brooks home, a sound that seemed out of place given that everyone believed Amira had moved away. But Mrs. Porter convinced herself she must have been mistaken, that it was probably a television, or perhaps a visitor, and she felt it would be rude to pry into a grieving widower's private life. This pattern would repeat itself over the years. Small moments of potential discovery, quickly smoothed over by the powerful human instinct to avoid confrontation, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to choose the comfortable explanation over the disturbing possibility. And while the outside world looked away, accepted the stories and moved on with their lives, a very different truth was taking shape inside the Brooks house. Amira had not gone to boarding school. She had not moved in with relatives. She had never left at all. The spring of 1996 brought warm weather and the kind of ordinary evenings when nothing seems particularly threatening. Amira was 18 years old now, legally an adult, but emotionally still reeling from her mother's death, still adjusting to a world that felt fundamentally broken. She trusted her father because he was the only parent she had left, because she had been raised to respect his authority, because she had no framework for understanding that a parent could become a predator. When Elias called her downstairs one evening, asking for help moving boxes in the basement, she obeyed without hesitation. Her small hand grazed the wooden railing as she descended the steps, the basement air growing cooler with each footfall, that particular smell of damp concrete and old foundations rising to meet her. A single bulb swung overhead, buzzing faintly as it flickered. When she reached the floor and turned to ask what he needed her to do, she heard the sound that would define the next 23 years of her life, the sharp, final click of a lock sliding into place. At first, Amira's mind rejected what was happening. She called out to her father, her voice uncertain, asking why he had locked the door, waiting for the joke to reveal itself. But Elias did not laugh. He did not apologize or explain that there had been some mistake. He simply stood at the top of the stairs, his silhouette outlined by the thin light from the kitchen, and said in that same calm, measured tone he'd always used, "This is where you'll stay now." The words landed with the weight of a life sentence. Amira laughed nervously at first, the kind of reflexive sound people make when reality becomes too strange to accept immediately. She pleaded with him to open the door, her voice climbing in pitch as disbelief gave way to genuine fear. But the only response was silence, and then the sound of his footsteps moving away across the floor above her head. Minutes stretched into hours. The disbelief slowly curdled into terror, and the basement, which had always been just another part of the house, transformed into something else entirely. The space was merciless in its simplicity, concrete walls, no windows to mark the passage of time or connect her to the world above. Just the unreliable bulb overhead that flickered without pattern, sometimes leaving her in complete darkness for hours, sometimes buzzing steadily until she wanted to scream just to have a different sound in her ears. Elias controlled everything now. The rhythm of her meals, pushing bowls of food down the stairs at irregular intervals, so that hunger became a constant companion. The moments when he chose to speak to her, his voice often gentle, almost tender, as if he were comforting a child rather than imprisoning his daughter. And the long stretches of silence when she was left entirely alone with nothing but her thoughts and the crushing weight of isolation. Sometimes when she begged him to let her out, to explain what was happening, to tell her what she had done wrong, he would kneel at the top of the stairs and speak in that soft, careful way that made cruelty sound like concern. He told her that she didn't belong in the outside world, that no one was looking for her, that people had moved on and forgotten about her. He said that the world was dangerous and that he was keeping her safe, that this was an act of protection rather than imprisonment. His tone was so steady, so reasonable, that for a girl who had lost her mother and had no one else to cling to, the psychological manipulation was devastatingly effective. At first, Amira believed him. She told herself this situation was temporary, that her father was going through some kind of breakdown related to grief, that eventually he would come to his senses and let her return to her life. She clung to memories of her mother, the sound of Lena's laugh, the warmth of her hands, the way she used to hum while cooking dinner. Amira whispered those memories into the cold basement air like prayers, using them as anchors to keep herself from completely unraveling. She spoke aloud to her mother, saying, "Mama, I miss you. Mama, I'm still here. Mama, please see me," her voice trembling in the darkness. But as weeks bled into months, as the isolation deepened and the reality of her situation became undeniable, hope began to thin. The walls seemed to press closer, the air grew heavier, and despair carved itself deep into her consciousness. She began marking time the only way she could, counting her meals and scratching tiny lines into the concrete with whatever small object she could find, each mark a proof to herself that days were still passing, that she still existed, that she had not simply disappeared into nothingness. Yet the basement was not entirely silent. In the quietest hours of night, Amira's sobs sometimes carried through the walls in ways she didn't intend. A neighbor later admitted during police interviews that she had once paused at her kitchen sink late at night, certain she'd heard a muffled cry coming from somewhere nearby, but she convinced herself it must have been a television left on, or perhaps an animal outside. Another neighbor remembered hearing shuffling sounds and rhythmic tapping near the foundation of the Brooks house, but decided it was probably rodents moving through the crawl space. Each moment of potential discovery flickered briefly, and then died, extinguished by the human tendency to accept simple explanations rather than confront disturbing possibilities. And in that basement, cut off from sunlight and freedom and human contact, Amira's world contracted to the dimensions of a cage. She was not just physically imprisoned, she was being systematically erased from existence by the man who should have protected her. And the abuse that began in that first year would evolve into something even more devastating as time went on. The summer of 1999 brought a new kind of terror, August 3rd specifically, when pain gripped Amira's body in a way she had never experienced before. She was 21 years old, curled on the concrete floor, her breathing short and fast, her fingers scraping for something to hold onto that wasn't there. She called out, her voice soft and ashamed and afraid, and footsteps answered from above. Elias came to the door and spoke to her through it, his tone low and careful, almost clinical. He told her to breathe, that he would guide her, that everything would be fine. He passed towels and water down to her, gave her instructions in the calm, measured voice of someone who had done this before, who knew every stage of what was happening. Control wore the mask of care. Hours dragged. The room smelled of iron and damp cement. The light flickered with every wave of pain. Amira bit down on her knuckles, counted to 10, then 20, then stopped counting because numbers became meaningless. And when the baby's cry finally pierced the air, thin and startled and alive, she pressed the child to her chest, and for a brief, blazing moment felt something that almost resembled hope. But that moment was measured in hours, not days. By morning, Elias had taken the child upstairs and did not bring the baby back. He told Amira in that same careful tone that the child would be safer elsewhere, that she had done well, that this was what she was meant to do. Love was recast as obligation. Grief was renamed purpose. And the cycle that would define the next 2 decades had begun. Investigators would later determine through forensic analysis and recovered records that between 1999 and 2022, Amira carried 20 pregnancies to term in that basement. 20 children, each one delivered in conditions that no medical professional would consider safe, each one taken from her arms before she could form the kind of bond that mothers and infants are supposed to share. Elias had turned his medical knowledge and his daughter's body into a systematic operation, forging birth certificates, falsifying hospital records, and creating an entire paper trail of lies that would allow him to sell each infant to buyers who were willing to pay for a child without asking too many questions about where that child had come from. The pattern became routine in its horror. Amira learned to recognize the signs of pregnancy, though she had no calendar to track dates and no way to seek medical care. She learned the stages of labor because she lived through them again and again, each time alone except for her father's voice, giving instructions from behind a locked door. She learned to measure time by her own body's cycles, by the growing and shrinking of her belly, by the brief moments of connection with each newborn before they were taken away. Elias rationed her food carefully, weighed her periodically, made notes in a ledger, as if she were a patient rather than a prisoner. He dressed his demands in language that sounded like destiny, telling her that some people are chosen to serve, that this was her purpose, that she was fulfilling an important role. The psychological manipulation was as brutal as the physical imprisonment. He was systematically breaking down her sense of self, convincing her that her only value lay in her ability to produce children for him to sell. At first, Amira fought back in small ways. She refused to speak to him for days at a time. She refused to eat, hoping that starvation might give her some leverage or at least some sense of control over her own body. But her protests met a wall of indifference. Elias simply waited her out, knowing that eventually hunger and isolation would force compliance. Then came the bargaining stage, the desperate negotiations where she promised perfect obedience if he would just let her keep one child, just one, so she wouldn't be completely alone. But the door never opened. The children never stayed. Later came numbness, a psychological winter that settled into her chest, where she learned to feel less so she could endure more. It was a survival mechanism, a way to protect whatever core of herself still remained intact. And through it all, above ground, the neighborhood maintained its ordinary rhythm. Lawnmowers hummed on Saturday mornings, mail was delivered, children played hopscotch on the sidewalk. No one looked too closely at the house with the locked basement window. The story that Elias had established, that Amira had moved away, that she was living her own life somewhere else, protected him perfectly. People repeated the story because it was easier than doubt, because questioning it would require action, because none of them wanted to believe that something so monstrous could be happening right next door. There were signs, of course. There are always signs. Around 2:15 one morning, Mrs. Elaine Porter, who lived across the street, paused at her kitchen sink and turned off the faucet because she thought she heard something. A baby's cry, thin and far away, drifting through the summer air. She stood very still, listening, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. But after a moment, she convinced herself it must have been a stray cat, or perhaps a television left on in someone's home, and she went back to bed, pulling the covers to her chin, never reporting what she'd heard. The years gathered one after another, and the basement stole them all. Pregnancy became a season, then a sentence, then simply the way things were. Each birth arrived with the same pattern, Elias at the door with water and towels, careful instructions delivered in that clinical tone. A brief blazing moment of joy as Amira held a new life against her chest, and then the silence after the door closed, which was always the loudest sound in her world. Through it all, she spoke to her mother. "Mama, I'm still here," she whispered into the darkness. "Mama, please see me." She marked days in the seams of mortar when she thought no one was watching, scratched tiny lines that proved time was still moving. She hid scraps of hope in the folds of her thin blanket, and she promised herself that if a sliver of light ever found this room, she would not look away. The children Elias took from Amira disappeared into an underground network that investigators would spend years trying to fully map. Some were sold to couples who were desperate for a child and willing to overlook irregularities in paperwork if it meant they could finally become parents. Others went to buyers who seemed to understand exactly what they were participating in, who paid in cash, who met in parking lots at odd hours, who asked no questions about the mother's identity or whereabouts. Elias was meticulous in his forgeries. He created birth certificates with fake mothers' names, stamped them with counterfeit seals, and forged signatures from nurses and doctors who had no idea their names were being used. He kept vaccination records updated, wrote medical histories that sounded plausible, and presented himself as a retired healthcare professional helping with private adoptions. The veneer of legitimacy was thin, but it was enough. People wanted to believe they were doing something noble, that they were giving a home to a child who needed one, and that belief made them complicit in a crime they could have stopped if they'd been willing to ask harder questions. Some of the buyers later claimed they had no idea anything was wrong. They said Elias seemed professional, that the paperwork looked official, that they assumed everything was legal and above board. But others, when pressed by investigators, admitted to doubts they had chosen to ignore. One man identified in court documents only as buyer. 14 testified that he had met Elias in a shopping center parking lot at night, that he had paid more than $30,000 in cash, and that when he asked about the mother, Elias had simply said she wanted privacy and couldn't be contacted. The man said he felt uneasy, but convinced himself that perhaps the mother was very young or in a difficult situation, and that by taking the child, he was helping everyone involved. It was a rationalization that allowed him to participate in human trafficking while maintaining the belief that he was acting ethically. The prosecution would later argue that this willful blindness was itself criminal, that anyone who paid tens of thousands of dollars in cash for a baby with questionable documentation bore some responsibility for what happened to Amira. By the final years of her captivity, Amira's heart had changed shape. She had moved through grief, rage, numbness, and had arrived at a kind of hollow endurance. She spoke less during the day and more in the darkness, telling her absent children stories they would never hear, building imaginary worlds where her mother waited in a sunlit kitchen and where there were always 2 chairs pulled out at the table. She wrote on scraps of paper when she could find them, using whatever implement came to hand, a broken pencil, a small nail, anything that could leave a mark. The notes were brief, scattered, desperate. "My womb is a cage. He calls this protection, it is not. I am Lena's child. She was kind and brave. I will be too." She hid these fragments behind a loose brick, under a shifting floorboard, inside the sleeve of her thin blanket. They were messages to a future she wasn't sure would ever come, proof that she had existed, that she had resisted, that she had tried to remain herself, even as everything was being stripped away. Above ground, Elias maintained his mask with extraordinary discipline. He understood that respectability is a kind of camouflage, that if you appear normal and trustworthy in small, consistent ways, people will extend that trust into areas where it doesn't belong. He paid his bills on time. He kept his lawn neat. He waved at neighbors and remembered their names. When someone's porch light burned out, he offered to change it. When mail was misdelivered, he walked it to the correct address and tucked it under the mat with care. These small acts of consideration accumulated into a reputation, and that reputation became a shield. People thought of Elias Brooks as a quiet, dependable man who had suffered a terrible loss and was doing his best to carry on with dignity. They had no framework for believing that this same man was capable of holding his own daughter captive for more than 2 decades while systematically exploiting her body for profit. There were neighbors who later admitted to small moments of unease that they had dismissed. Ronald Hayes, who lived across the alley, told investigators that Elias always kept his basement door locked, even during summer storms when everyone else opened doors and windows to create airflow. Hayes said he noticed but assumed it was just a personal preference, perhaps related to storing something valuable or simply being a private person. Mrs. Porter mentioned that Elias never invited anyone into his home, always meeting people on the porch or in the yard, and that while this seemed slightly odd, it also wasn't unusual for someone who was grieving and preferred solitude. These observations, which individually seemed insignificant, formed a pattern that only became visible in retrospect. The locked door, the controlled access, the plausible explanations delivered with just enough detail to discourage follow-up questions. Elias had built a system of social protection around his crime, and that system worked because people are generally inclined to think the best of their neighbors unless given overwhelming evidence to do otherwise. In the years after Elias resigned from the hospital, He occasionally encountered former colleagues in public. One nurse, Patricia Gaines, ran into him at a grocery store in the early 2000s and asked casually how his daughter was doing. She remembered that Elias used to talk proudly about Amira's report cards and her plans for the future, and she was curious to know how the girl had turned out. Elias didn't hesitate. He placed apples carefully in a bag, tied the knot precisely and said she's away, doing fine, with no additional detail. Patricia tried to ask a follow-up question, something light about whether Amira was in college or working, but Elias deflected by mentioning church events and the weather, then excused himself politely. Patricia stood there for a long moment after he left, feeling that something about the interaction had been off, that pride should have lit his voice when talking about his daughter, but instead there had been only a kind of flat deflection. She considered calling someone, though she wasn't sure who or why, but then life intervened with its ordinary demands and the moment passed. She wrote a note on a sticky pad, call someone about Elias, then threw the note away when the phone rang about something unrelated. That was the hinge moment, the moment when action could have prevented years of continued suffering, and it swung shut silently. The sounds that emanated from the Brooks house over the years were explained away with a variety of reasonable-sounding stories. When neighbors heard thuds or tapping, Elias said it was old plumbing that made noise when the water heater cycled. When someone heard what might have been a voice, he mentioned that he sometimes cared for ill relatives who stayed overnight. When a patrol car was dispatched following a noise complaint in the summer of 2010, Elias invited the officers inside, showed them neatly organized medical records for a supposed patient, and even demonstrated how the copper pipes resonated when struck, creating sounds that could easily be mistaken for something more concerning. The officers left satisfied that they had investigated thoroughly and found nothing amiss. What they couldn't see, 30 inches below their boots, was Amira sitting motionless on her cot, counting slowly to 20 with a blanket pressed to her mouth to muffle any sound, waiting for the footsteps above to retreat. When they did, when the voices faded and the door closed and the house went quiet again, she let her forehead touch the cold wall and allowed herself to cry silently, knowing that rescue had come within feet of her, and then walked away. The neighborhood's failure was not a failure of individual cruelty, but a systemic failure of collective attention. Each person who heard something and dismissed it, each person who noticed an oddity and decided it wasn't their business, each person who felt a moment of unease and then let it go, contributed to Amira's continued imprisonment. This is not to say that every neighbor bears equal guilt, but rather to acknowledge that the crime was sustained not just by one man's evil, but by a community's collective decision to choose comfort over confrontation. The question that haunts many of them now is a simple one. What would it have cost to knock on the door one more time? To ask a question that felt awkward? To call the police with nothing more than a suspicion and a willingness to be wrong? The answer is that it would have cost very little. A moment of social discomfort, the risk of looking foolish, the possibility of offending a neighbor. Weighed against 23 years of captivity, 20 pregnancies, 20 children taken from their mother's arms, these costs seem trivial. But in the moment, when evil wears the face of a grieving widower, when abuse hides behind locked doors and plausible explanations, it is disturbingly easy to look away. October 14, 2018, 9:13 in the morning. Ronald Hayes had hired a contractor to finish a playroom in his basement before his first grandchildren arrived for extended visits. The plan was straightforward: new drywall, improved lighting. A fresh coat of paint that would transform the space into somewhere children could play safely. The work felt hopeful, practical, the kind of home improvement that marked a new chapter in life. But when the foreman's hammer struck the wall, the sound that came back was all wrong. He tapped again, pressing his ear to the plaster, and whispered to his crew that there was empty space behind the surface, where there should have been solid dirt and foundation. They cut a careful rectangle into the wall, and plaster fell away like eggshell. A gap opened that shouldn't have existed. The foreman dropped his flashlight into the darkness and hissed a breath through his teeth. "This isn't your foundation," he told Ronald. "This was built after. Someone carved a passage here and it runs toward the property line." Police arrived first, followed quickly by county code enforcement investigators. Officer Dinah Ruiz crouched at the opening and tested the air, tasting damp lime and old dust. She glanced at her partner, Officer Tom Avery, whose flashlight beam trembled slightly as it rode along crude concrete and rough mortar seams. Ruiz said calmly, "At worst, it's an illegal storage addition. We'll cite it and seal it," and her words were meant to steady everyone, including herself. They entered the void single file, shoulders turned sideways, boots scraping. The tunnel was narrow and irregular, clearly hand-built rather than professionally constructed. At 15 feet in, the beam found lumber and hardware. A door, chained from the outside, no interior handle. Officer Avery stopped moving. His voice was quiet when he said, "Ruiz, you seeing this?" Above them, neighbors had begun filtering down Ronald's stairs, offering theories they didn't quite believe. Maybe a storm shelter from decades ago, maybe bootleg storage from Prohibition. But the word chain traveled faster than their rationalizations, and the atmosphere changed. Inside the tunnel, Ruiz traced the chain with 2 fingers until it met the heavy lock on the outer face of the door. She didn't speak for several seconds, and when she did, her voice was soft and professional and carried the weight of understanding exactly what they'd found. "This isn't storage," she said. "This keeps someone in." Avery radioed for detectives immediately. More officers arrived. A fire crew brought pry bars and bolt cutters. They photographed everything, documented the angles, logged the type and condition of the hardware, and then they did what had to be done. They forced the door open, metal screamed, the chain jumped and fell, the lock split. The door shuddered inward by inches, revealing a throat of darkness that smelled of stale air, old linen and human habitation. Ruiz lifted her hand, palm out, and said, "Flashlights high, stay tight," and they entered. The beam found a cot, a metal bowl, grey handprints on the wall where a palm had rested too many times, and then it found Amira. She was curled on her side, knees pulled close, hair tangled, hands tucked beneath her chin. She didn't flinch immediately when the light touched her. It was as if she couldn't quite process that the light was real, that the voices were real, that something had finally changed. Then her eyes opened and she lifted one hand slowly, palm up, not to shield herself but as a gesture that seemed to ask for gentleness. Her lips parted, and the words that came were almost inaudible. "Please don't take them." Ruiz knelt, keeping her voice very soft. "I'm Dana," she said. "We're here to help you. You're safe now." The word safe hung in the air, like something fragile. Avery uncapped his canteen and held it steady as Amira tried to sit up, her legs unsteady, her body weak. He caught her elbow gently as she nearly fell. More officers widened the opening. Firefighters worked the pry bar until the doorway was large enough for Amira to pass through without stooping. Ruiz draped a blanket over Amira's shoulders, the wool heavy and warm, and Amira closed her eyes for just a moment, as if remembering what kindness felt like. She tried to speak again, her voice barely a thread. "He takes them. Don't let him." The sentence fractured there because 19 years of grief had to pass through a throat that had been forced into silence for far too long. They guided her toward the breach, each movement careful and measured. The first touch of natural daylight found her face at 7:03 in the evening. It stung. She turned her head and squinted, eyes red and wet, and still she took another step. A breeze touched her skin, cool and leaf-scented, ordinary to everyone else but overwhelming to someone who had not felt moving air in more than 2 decades. She pressed the blanket closer and kept walking. Outside, the neighborhood had gone completely silent. Ronald Hayes stood on his porch, gripping the railing so hard his knuckles were white. He would later say that every unexplained sound he had dismissed came back to him in that moment as an accusation. The winter knocks he'd attributed to settling, the summer cries he'd assumed were television, the late-night disturbances he'd smoothed over with courtesy. Elaine Porter stood in her yard with her hands hovering at her chest, staring at the basement window she had once called a quirk, and her lips formed a prayer she hadn't said since childhood. Paramedic Jada Coulson met Amira at the threshold and spoke calmly. "I'm Jada, I've got you," and she found Amira's wrist to count a pulse that fluttered like a trapped bird. She dimmed the ambulance's interior lights, pulled a cap over Amira's head to shield her eyes, and turned her own body to create shade. "Small steps," she said. "We'll go as slow as you need." In the ambulance, she warmed a second blanket and slid it behind Amira's back, speaking in short sentences that didn't demand answers. "You're safe. You're with us. Breathe in, breathe out. That's it." Amira looked past the open ambulance doors into the fading October sky and asked in a voice no louder than a whisper, "Is it morning?" Jada smiled, soft and certain. "It's evening," she said. "But for you, this is the first day." On the gurney, Amira's fingers curled and uncurled, testing the space around her as if learning for the first time that she could move freely. Across the street, more neighbors gathered, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dusk. In the quiet, each of them remembered their own moment of decision. The magnet note never sent, the phone call never made, the joke about hauntings that deflected real concern. Elias's mask had fooled them, yes, but their silence had helped keep it in place. The rescue felt less like a single heroic act and more like the beginning of a long reckoning, pushed through a very narrow opening into the light of day. Within 24 hours, investigators began piecing together the full scope of what had happened inside the Brooks house. Forensic teams scoured every inch of the property. In a locked desk drawer, they found birth certificates with forged signatures, vaccination records filled with false dates, and hospital discharge papers that referenced mothers who did not exist. Some of the documents showed signs of repeated handling, coffee stains and bent corners, suggesting someone who checked and rechecked their deception regularly. DNA analysis confirmed what the documents suggested. Amira was the biological mother of 20 children, each one delivered in secret, each one taken from her within hours or days of birth. And genetic testing revealed something even more disturbing. Elias Brooks was the biological father of every single child. This was not a case of facilitating illegal adoptions. This was systematic incest, rape, and human trafficking carried out over more than 2 decades. Detectives traced the financial records, uncovering a web of accounts and transactions that revealed the profit motive behind Elias's crimes. His modest nursing pension and occasional consulting fees couldn't explain the patterns of wealth they found. A new truck purchased in cash in 2007, a land purchase in an adjacent county in 2012, wire transfers of tens of thousands of dollars from individuals whose names appeared nowhere else in his financial history. Each trail led back to an underground network of buyers, people who had paid for children without asking the questions that might have prevented the transaction. Some of these buyers were later prosecuted. Others cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, providing details about how Elias operated, how he presented himself, what he said to reassure them that everything was legitimate. One detective, Marcus Green, a 20-year veteran with extensive experience in human trafficking cases, told reporters that this case was different from anything he'd encountered before. "We've seen trafficking networks," he said. "We've seen exploitation. But this was a father turning his own child into a commodity, and a community that enabled it through willful blindness." The words stung because they implicated not just Elias, but the broader social structure that had failed to protect Amira. Neighbors who had waved politely for years now stood in front of cameras, struggling to explain how they hadn't known. Ronald Hayes, whose renovation led to the discovery, shook his head repeatedly during his interview. "I heard noises," he said, voice breaking. "I heard them and I told myself it was plumbing. I saw him lock that basement during storms and thought it was just his way. He fooled us, but I fooled myself too because I didn't want to believe anything was wrong." Elaine Porter wept openly at a candlelight vigil held outside New Hope Baptist Church. Flames flickered along the sidewalk, bending in the October wind. "He sang hymns next to me," she said through tears. "He prayed for my husband when he was sick. And all that time his daughter was locked underground, forced to bear his children. How do we forgive ourselves for not seeing it?" The vigil drew hundreds of people from the neighborhood and beyond, many holding candles, many holding signs that read "Believe survivors and never again." The mood was somber, reflective, and tinged with collective guilt. Speaker after speaker stood at the microphone to acknowledge that evil had flourished, not in some distant place, but right here, in a quiet residential neighborhood, where people knew each other's names and waved from porches and attended the same church services. The recognition that proximity is not the same as attention became a central theme of the community's reckoning. Prosecutors presented their findings methodically. 20 pregnancies over 23 years, each birth covered by falsified documents, each child sold for profit, ranging from $15,000 to $50,000, depending on the buyer's desperation and financial resources. Court filings noted Elias's meticulous record-keeping. He had charted Amira's weight, blood pressure, and labor duration with the precision of a medical professional. But these were not patient records. They were the documentation of systematic abuse. The tragedy, prosecutors argued, was not only in what Elias did, but in how long he was able to sustain it. He built a public persona so convincing, a mask of grief and quiet dignity, that even those closest to him never thought to pull it away. He leaned on his professional background, his status as a widower, his reputation in the church community, and he used all of these things as cover for crimes that were happening in plain sight. The evidence trail was overwhelming. Financial documents showing deposits that corresponded with approximate birth dates, testimony from buyers about cash payments and forged paperwork, DNA results that conclusively established biological relationships, medical experts who examined Amira and documented physical evidence of multiple pregnancies and inadequate health care, forensic analysts who demonstrated how signatures had been copied and dates altered on official forms, and most powerfully, Amira herself, who testified about the basement, the locked door, the births, and the systematic theft of her children. The case against Elias Brooks was not built on circumstantial evidence or questionable testimony. It was built on a mountain of facts that could not be disputed or explained away. January 7, 2020. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed in. Elias Brooks sat at the defense table in a plain suit, wrists in steel cuffs, chin tucked, eyes fixed on a spot on the wooden table in front of him. He faced charges that were read aloud in an even, formal tone: human trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, child abuse, sexual assault. Each count carried significant prison time, and together they formed a potential life sentence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented their case with calm precision, walking jurors through a timeline that began with Lena's death in 1995 and ended with Amira's rescue in 2018. They showed photographs of the basement, the chained door, the crude passage carved through the foundation. They introduced financial records, forged documents, and DNA analyses. They called witnesses who testified to Elias's meticulous planning and his ability to deceive people who should have known better. Then came the moment that mattered most. Amira testified from behind a screen, her silhouette visible but her face obscured to protect her privacy. She spoke haltingly at first, stopping when memories became too heavy, swallowing air when emotion threatened to overwhelm her words, and then pushing forward because the truth was the only path left. She told the jury about the day her father locked the basement door, about the years that followed, about the births and the terrible emptiness that came each time a child was taken from her arms, about the psychological manipulation, the constant assertions that she was serving a purpose, that this was what she was meant to do, that no one in the outside world cared about her or was looking for her. When the prosecutor asked the critical question, "Did you ever consent?" Amira's breath steadied and her answer was clear and firm. "No," she said. "He was my father, but he was also my jailer." The courtroom was absolutely silent. A woman in the gallery put her hand over her mouth. A juror's pen stopped moving mid-note. The defense attempted to construct a narrative of grief-driven confusion, suggesting that Elias had suffered some kind of psychological break following his wife's death and had acted out of a twisted belief that he was protecting his daughter. But the evidence didn't support that theory. The financial records showed planning and profit motive. The forged documents demonstrated clear intent to deceive. The systematic nature of the abuse over 2 decades revealed not confusion, but calculated exploitation. Midweek, the prosecution called a witness who had agreed to testify under a protective order, listed in court documents only as Buyer 14. He kept his eyes on the courtroom rail as he explained how the meetings were arranged, how cash was exchanged in parking lots, how he received a newborn in 2007, along with papers that seemed official, but in retrospect contained obvious irregularities. He described Elias as punctual, professional, never nervous, someone who presented the transaction as a private adoption that would help everyone involved. His voice shook when he admitted, "I told myself I was saving a child, but I paid to take part in a crime." The evidence mounted relentlessly. Financial analysts drew direct lines from shell accounts to deposits. Medical experts testified about the impossibility of safe childbirth in the conditions Amira had endured. DNA specialists explained that the genetic profiles left no room for doubt about parentage. Each piece of evidence reinforced the others, creating a case that was airtight from multiple angles. Elias barely moved throughout the trial. He didn't lift his eyes when Amira spoke. He didn't react when photographs of the basement appeared on screens around the courtroom. He didn't turn when the chain from the door was entered into evidence and placed on a foam display for the jury to examine. Only once did the mask slip visibly. During a playback of excerpts from Amira's hidden diary, Scrap's words projected 10 feet high on a screen. "My womb is a cage. My body is not mine." He was not given the right to call this love. A muscle in his jaw twitched, and his hands briefly clenched. Then his face went blank again. On March 2, 2020, closing arguments brought the case to its conclusion. The prosecutor spoke about trust as a weapon, about how Elias had used his daughter's dependence and grief to trap her, about how he had exploited his medical knowledge and community, standing to sustain a criminal enterprise for more than 2 decades. She asked the jury to see not only the basement, but the years the world refused to see it, the neighbors who heard and dismissed the colleagues who asked and accepted vague answers, the systems that processed forged paperwork without adequate scrutiny. "This is a case about what happens," she said, "when we collectively decide that someone else's closed door is none of our business." The defense returned to themes of grief and psychological damage, but the jury had heard too much, seen too much to accept those explanations. Deliberation took less than 4 hours. When the foreperson stood and read the verdict, the words came firm and clear: guilty on all counts. The judge's sentence followed 2 weeks later with the formal rhythm of finality. Life without the possibility of parole, plus consecutive sentences that ensured Elias Brooks would spend every remaining day of his life in custody. The judge added remarks about the law's limitations, noting that no sentence could return the years taken or the children stolen, but that justice required the strongest possible punishment. In the silence that followed, people in the gallery exhaled. Some wept, some prayed. Some sat very still and let the verdict settle into the spaces where shock and disbelief had lived for months. Behind the screen, those who were close to Amira reported later, she bowed her head and whispered a single word that was not recorded in the official transcript: "Mama." Spring of 2020. The trial was over, the verdict rendered and the sentence delivered. But for Amira Brooks, freedom was not a sudden transformation. It was a slow, uncertain process of learning how to exist in a world that no longer felt familiar. Her first morning outside the care facility where she was receiving intensive support, she stood at the threshold of a wide glass door. A nurse asked gently if she wanted to walk in the courtyard, and Amira nodded, but her body wouldn't move. The sunlight poured across the pavement in warm streaks. Wind carried the faint sound of birds. Yet she stood frozen, bare feet gripping the floor, because for 23 years, light had meant interrogation, not comfort. It took nearly 10 minutes for her to cross that doorway, and when she finally did, her shoulders shook with sobs she couldn't explain. The world was open, and openness itself was terrifying. Therapy began with the simplest possible foundations. Dr. Nia Calloway, a trauma specialist with extensive experience in captivity cases, sat across from Amira in a room painted pale green and started each session with grounding exercises. Name 3 objects you can see. Place both hands flat on this wooden table. Breathe until the air no longer hurts. Amira would tap the wood 3 times before speaking, as if checking that it was solid, that reality would hold. Sometimes she couldn't finish sentences. Sometimes she spoke in fragments about nights when silence was louder than screams, about measuring time by footsteps on the floor above her head, about the terrible moment each time when a newborn's cry would fade as it was carried away. Dr. Calloway never rushed. "You are here now," she would say quietly. You own this space. And slowly, painfully, Amira began to believe it. Outside of therapy, every aspect of daily life required relearning. Grocery stores overwhelmed her. She stood frozen in the cereal aisle, staring at rows of colors and choices, unable to make a decision when for decades her meals had been completely controlled. Crowds made her anxious. Sudden laughter startled her. Thunder caused her to fold in on herself protectively. But there were also small wonders that brought unexpected joy. She tasted strawberry ice cream for the first time since childhood and laughed through her tears, saying it reminded her of her mother, who used to buy it after long hospital shifts. She walked barefoot in grass and whispered that it felt softer than any blanket she had been given in captivity. These moments of rediscovery were precious, proof that parts of herself had survived intact, despite everything that had been done to her. But there was one wound that never closed, one source of pain that therapy and time could not fully heal: the children. She asked investigators repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in a single day, "Where are my children now? Do they even know I exist? Can I see them? Can I just know they're safe?" The answers were always partial, always painful. Some children had been traced through adoption records that post-trial court orders had unsealed. Others were identified through financial files and DNA databases. But many remained lost in sealed agreements, private adoptions that were difficult or impossible to unwind legally, even after Elias's conviction. Each time investigators delivered news, whether it was "we found another child" or "we've hit another dead end," Amira's face would show a brief flash of hope or despair before settling back into careful neutrality. At night, she wrote in a new journal, this one not hidden. And on the first page she had written, "They were mine for minutes, but they were mine forever." The neighborhood carried its own complicated burden of guilt and grief. Ronald Hayes visited Amira at the trauma center several weeks after the trial. His hand shook as he sat across from her in a visiting room and admitted what he had heard over the years. The knocks, the cries, the sounds he had convinced himself weren't real or weren't important. "I should have asked," he said, voice breaking. "I should have gone to your door, should have called someone. Should have done anything other than what I did, which was nothing." Amira, still learning how to interact with people without fear, placed her hand gently on his arm. "You opened the wall," she said softly. "Because of that, I'm here." He wept openly, his guilt colliding with her grace, unable to fully accept forgiveness for something he couldn't forgive in himself. Elaine Porter stood before the congregation at New Hope Baptist and made a public confession. "I heard her," she said, voice steady despite the tears running down her face. "I saw shadows in that basement window. I chose silence. I told myself it was easier to believe nothing was wrong than to risk being intrusive or wrong or awkward. And now I have to live with that choice." Parents in the congregation clutched their children tighter. The flicker of candles reflected in windows. The collective shame of a community was being acknowledged aloud, and while acknowledgement couldn't change the past, it was a necessary step toward ensuring the future would be different. Pastor Ruth Lynn, who had preached beside Elias for years, told the congregation, "We mistook manners for morality. We confused privacy with safety. We saw a mask and called it character. That cannot happen here again. We have to learn to ask the uncomfortable questions." Amira's healing came in waves. There were days she laughed while rediscovering music she had missed, learning about technology that hadn't existed when she was locked away, tasting foods that were new to her. And there were days when she wept after passing a mother pushing a stroller, when the sight of other people's ordinary happiness emphasized the enormity of what had been taken from her. She prayed each night before a photograph of her mother, Lena, lighting a small candle, and whispering, "I'm still here, Mama, you didn't lose me, I made it back." The ritual grounded her, connected her to the person she had been before the basement, reminded her that she was more than what had been done to her. Freedom gave Amira something she thought she would never hold again: choice. The choice to walk in daylight. The choice to taste sweetness. The choice to write her own words without hiding them. The choice to speak or remain silent, based on her own needs, rather than someone else's control. For the first time in more than 2 decades, the silence in her life belonged to her. The story was no longer being written by chains and locked doors. It was being written by her survival, her resilience, and her slow, painful, ongoing process of rebuilding a self that had been systematically dismantled. The basement was empty now. The door was open, and Amira was learning day by difficult day what it meant to be free. The trial ended, the verdict was final, and the legal system had delivered its judgment. But shadows remained. The deepest wound, the one that no verdict could address, was the question of the children. 20 births over 23 years, 20 lives that began in a basement and then scattered into the world through a network of illegal transactions. Investigators worked tirelessly to trace them, using DNA databases, financial records, and cooperation from some of the buyers who had come forward. A few children were located in adoption files where Elias's forgeries had managed to slip past overworked clerks and judges who processed thousands of cases. Others were identified through genetic matches taken after the trial opened new investigative avenues, but many simply vanished into the gaps of a system that wasn't designed to track this kind of crime. Each time Amira met with investigators, she asked the same question with persistent, quiet hope. Where are my children now? Do they know I exist? Can I meet them someday? And each time the answers were incomplete, painful, honest about the limitations of what could be recovered. The legal questions surrounding the buyers proved almost as complicated as locating the children. Buyer 14 had testified, exposing a network that reached across state lines and involved dozens of transactions. But prosecution was uneven. Some buyers faced criminal charges for their participation in human trafficking and falsifying adoption documents. Others cooperated with investigators in exchange for immunity, providing information about how Elias operated and who else might have been involved. And some simply faded into obscurity, protected by expensive lawyers, sealed records, and the argument that they had been deceived victims rather than willing participants. The public grappled with difficult questions. Were these people desperate parents who had been lied to, or were they complicit in exploitation because they had chosen not to ask hard questions when irregularities appeared? Prosecutors admitted that justice was complicated when every child represented both innocence and evidence, when unwinding illegal adoptions meant potentially devastating the only families these children had ever known. Amira herself wrestled with this reality. In her journal she wrote, "Do they tell my children they were loved, or do they tell them nothing at all? Do my children know they have a mother who wanted them, who held them for those brief moments, who never stopped thinking about them?" The questions had no easy answers. Some of the children, now ranging in age from infants to young adults, were told the truth about their origins as part of the legal process. Others remained unaware, their adoptive parents choosing to shield them from a history that seemed too traumatic to process. Amira respected these decisions, even as they caused her pain, understanding that the children's well-being had to come first, that her need for connection couldn't override their need for stability. The community's reckoning continued long after the trial ended. Ronald Hayes admitted in interviews that he lay awake most nights replaying sounds he had once dismissed, the muffled cries he blamed on television, the sharp thuds he attributed to plumbing, the winter knocks he called settling. Now when he heard any unusual sound from a neighbor's home, he investigated immediately, sometimes knocking on doors late at night, unwilling to ever again dismiss something that might be a cry for help. He lingered longer at his grandchildren's bedroom doors, checking locks, listening for whispers in darkness, unable to trust silence the way he once had. Elaine Porter crossed the street now to speak directly with neighbors she used to simply wave at, asking more questions, showing more interest, determined that connection would replace the polite distance that had enabled evil to flourish. Detectives carried their own unease. Marcus Green told reporters, "You look at every unexplained absence differently now. Every parent who says their kid moved away. Every story that sounds too neat. You wonder if this could happen here, and the answer is it absolutely can. It can happen anywhere." His words unsettled families across the state and beyond, as news coverage spread the story nationally. Parents became more vigilant. Teachers received training on signs of family isolation and control. Social workers adjusted protocols for following up on children who disappeared from schools without clear documentation. The case became a catalyst for systemic change, not because people wanted to believe such horror was common, but because Amira's story proved that it was possible, that ordinary neighborhoods could hide extraordinary crimes, that respectability was not the same as safety. For Amira, the unanswered questions became part of her daily existence. She walked through open fields but wondered where her children played. She tasted freedom, but felt the constant absence of names and faces she should have known. Each candle she lit carried a double prayer, one for her mother and one unspoken hope that somewhere one of her children might light a candle too without even understanding why, that some connection might exist beyond conscious memory. Therapists assured her that children who had been removed as infants would have no memory of her, no trauma from the separation since they had never formed attachment, but this knowledge brought cold comfort. They might not remember, but she remembered every single one, every birth, every moment holding them, every time the door closed and they were gone. When freedom comes after decades of captivity, it brings not just relief but existential questions about identity. Who was Amira Brooks now? She was not the 17-year-old girl who had been locked in a basement. That person was gone, stolen by time and trauma. She was not defined solely by what had been done to her, though that experience was undeniably central to who she had become. She was a mother to 20 children she might never see again. She was a survivor of systematic abuse. She was someone learning to navigate a world that had continued without her, that had changed in ways she was still discovering. Technology she didn't understand, social norms that had shifted, references and cultural moments she had missed entirely. Her identity was still unfolding, being constructed piece by piece through therapy and small daily choices and the gradual rebuilding of a self that had been systematically dismantled. Night settles gently now over the neighborhood where Amira once lived in captivity. She lives elsewhere, in a location kept confidential for her safety and privacy. But sometimes she drives past the old street, not stopping, just observing that ordinary block where extraordinary evil had been hidden. The Brooks house stands empty, seized by the state and marked as a crime scene that may eventually be demolished. In her current home, Amira lights a candle on her windowsill each evening. The glass shakes slightly in the draft. The wick steadies. A soft circle of light touches her face. She closes her eyes, breathes slowly, and whispers a name only she can hear. Outside her window, the world continues. Inside, she is learning that survival is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one, written in her own hand, in her own time, with her own words. This story was never only about a single crime or a single criminal. It was about the systems that enabled that crime to continue for 23 years, silence from neighbors who heard but dismissed, habit and routine that made locked doors seem like quirks rather than warnings, the comfort of simple explanations that prevented people from confronting disturbing possibilities. A father locked a door, and a community locked away its doubt. People told themselves they were being polite, respecting privacy, avoiding the embarrassment of being wrong about a grieving widower. But courtesy overruled instinct, and the cost of that choice was measured in decades. The question that haunts everyone who looks closely at this case is simple and terrible. Why didn't anyone look deeper? The answer is that looking deeper carries a cost. It requires risking social awkwardness, being the neighbor who knocks when everyone else stays quiet, potentially being wrong in public, and finding something you can never unsee. It is easier, always easier, to accept the tidy answer than to carry a heavy truth. But consider the bill that arrived for that ease. 23 years of captivity, 20 forced pregnancies, 20 children stolen from their mother, one woman's entire young adulthood erased. The human cost of collective silence is incalculable. Amira's voice deserves to remain at the center of this story. She keeps a journal now, entries that range from celebratory to devastated. Some days she writes, "I took 10 steps without counting them. I remembered that walking can be automatic, that I don't have to measure every movement." Other days the entries are heavier. "I heard a child laugh in the park today, and I stood completely still until the sound passed because I couldn't let myself imagine that laugh belonging to one of mine." Healing is not a straight line. It bends through memory, lives alongside grief, requires patience with setbacks and small victories. She has said in therapy sessions, "The world is so loud, I'm still learning which sounds are safe, which sudden noises are just doors closing, and which might be threats." And she has also said, "Freedom means I choose when to speak now. I choose silence or voice." And that choice itself is a kind of miracle. New voices have joined the conversation that Amira's case sparked. Pastor Ruth Lynn tells her congregation now, "We mistook kindness for safety and privacy for trust. We saw a mask of respectability and called it character that cannot stand here again. We have to learn to ask uncomfortable questions even when asking feels rude." Detective Marcus Green stands at community forums and admits, "We in law enforcement believed paperwork more than people. We processed documents without adequate scrutiny. We accepted explanations that seemed plausible without pushing for details. We won't make that trade anymore." Their words represent a stripping away of the excuses that hid behind routine, an acknowledgement that institutions and individuals both failed Amira in ways that must be named and addressed. Neighbors have learned different rules through painful experience. Ronald Hayes now knocks immediately when any noise seems off, stays until someone answers, refuses to accept silence as an explanation. Elaine Porter keeps a list on her refrigerator titled, "Ask Anyway." Items that remind her to check on neighbors even when it feels intrusive, to offer help even when it might be refused, to prioritize connection over comfort. She teaches her grandchildren to speak up even when their voices shake, explaining that courage is not about being loud, but about being consistent, about caring enough to risk being wrong. The law has adjusted slowly but meaningfully in response to cases like Amira's. Agencies now flag patterns that once slipped through: sudden school withdrawals without forwarding information, repeated private adoptions with minimal documentation, stories about absent children that never evolve or gain detail when questioned at different times. Nurses and teachers sit through updated training that names what used to be unnamed, that provides specific language for reporting suspicions, that emphasizes the duty to investigate over the fear of being mistaken. None of these changes is perfect. Systems remain imperfect, people still miss signs. But collective awareness has shifted, and that shift matters because it means the next Amira might be found sooner, might be believed more quickly, might receive help before decades pass. The unanswered questions remain, and they are significant. Where are all 20 children scattered across the country and possibly beyond? How many buyers will ever face consequences for their participation in this network? How many other locked basements exist in other neighborhoods where other victims wait for rescue that hasn't come? These questions don't weaken the truth of what happened to Amira. They honor the weight of what remains unsolved, what cannot be fully repaired, what justice can address but never entirely heal. Amira's life now moves in small victories that carry enormous meaning. She walks in a public park at dusk, choosing a bench where she can see all the paths, maintaining awareness while also allowing herself to simply exist in open space. She buys strawberries at the market, closes her eyes at the first bite and smiles through the ache of memory, because that taste connects her to her mother and to a version of herself that existed before the basement. She lights 2 candles, some nights one for Lena, who she never stopped talking to even in the darkest moments, and one for the children whose names she was never allowed to keep, but whose existence shaped her in ways that can never be erased. And she writes, "I am still here, and if you are too, wherever you are, I hope you can feel it somehow. I hope you know you were wanted, even though we were separated. I hope you are loved." The words go into her journal and into the universe, and she has to trust that writing them matters even without knowing if they will ever reach the people they are intended for. What should we carry forward from Amira's story? The understanding that harm does not always hide in obvious darkness. It often sits in plain sight, attends church, waves from driveways, maintains neat lawns, thanks ushers, and participates in all the ordinary rituals of community life. Evil can wear the face of a grieving widower, a quiet professional, a man who changes his neighbor's porch bulb and refuses pie in return. Decency without scrutiny becomes camouflage. Respectability without accountability becomes a shield for abuse. Care must be active, must involve asking questions even when those questions feel uncomfortable, must prioritize truth over social ease. The hardest question this case poses is not what did Elias Brooks do, because that has been documented and judged. The harder question is, what did the rest of us fail to do? How did an entire community participate through inaction in the sustained abuse of someone who lived among them? In every neighborhood, behind doors that seem no different from any other, there may be stories that no one wants to believe are real. Children being abused, elderly people being neglected, domestic violence hidden by smiles in public, trafficking and exploitation happening while neighbors assume everything is fine. The question is whether we are willing to look, to ask, to risk the discomfort of being wrong in exchange for the possibility of being right and saving someone. What would you do if this was happening next door to you right now? Would you notice the signs? Would you trust your instincts when something felt off? Would you knock on the door, call the authorities, refuse to accept vague explanations? Or would you, like so many in Amira's neighborhood, choose the easier path of assuming everything is fine, because assuming otherwise requires action, and action is hard? These are not rhetorical questions. They are practical ones that every person must answer for themselves, because Amira's story proves that ordinary silence enables extraordinary evil, and that changing outcomes requires changing our willingness to see what we would prefer to ignore.